to talk with Professor Irving Gottesman. To be honest, Irv's office is just, I think, 2 down the hallway from my own, so I do get to talk with him quite a bit. But what's really special for me is you've had to sit through 8 weeks of getting my perspective on the field, and I think it would be really nice to get someone else's, a real giant in the field, perspective on this field of behavioral genetics. Irv is, I don't want to embarrass him at the beginning here, but Irv is really one of the preeminent, if not the preeminent, behavioral geneticists. I just want to make, if I tried to summarize his resume, his CV, we would take all our time just doing that. So I just want to make 2 points. One is Irv got his PhD a few years ago from the University of Minnesota. And it really shows that this was a very forward-looking institution back then. Secondly, a scientist at the end of his or her career loves to get lifetime achievements from the associations that they've participated in and contributed in. I looked through Irv's CV this morning, and I counted, and I might have counted off Irv, but I counted 10 different lifetime achievements from 10 different organizations. He really is one of the most celebrated behavioral geneticists in the world. So thanks for coming and sharing your thoughts with the students here today. The first thing I wanted to start with is something that we touched on very early in the course. We began the course with the history, the early history of the field and Galton. Of course, you weren't around then. Galton and how behavioral genetics was really probably discredited by the eugenics movement. But it reemerged in the 60s and the 70s, and you were there then. You were a young researcher at that time. You did your dissertation here in 1960 on the genetics of personality, which really must have just, I don't even know how you sold that to your advisors. And I guess it would be very interesting to get your perspective on how it is that psychology began to come back to behavioral genetics in the 60s and 70s, and what it was like for pioneers like you at that time.
I didn't know that I was a pioneer until much later, but I was very lucky that I chose the U of M for my graduate training. Mm-hmm. I came here on the GI Bill. You may not know that. Mm-hmm. No. After having served in the Korean War as a naval officer. Mm-hmm. And during that long periods of time at sea, I read psychology and psychiatry journals, and I came to the conclusion that there was no better place than Minnesota for learning about clinical psychology. Mm-hmm. And I was one of the first graduates of the child clinical psychology program. Mm-hmm. But early in my education here, which began actually in 1956, mm-hmm. so in the middle of the last century, mm-hmm. I was very fortunate in taking a course in individual differences. And that changed my whole life and my perspective about clinical psychology and psychology in general. And that course, which was then a 2-quarter course, was taught by D.G. Patterson, another icon of Minnesota psychology, and Jim Jenkins, another icon. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And during that course, I read about twin studies of schizophrenia and other kinds of mental illness. Okay. And I thought, gee, it would really be cool if someday I could pull off something like that, but do it so as to avoid the criticisms that have been leveled. And the criticisms that were leveled often came from people who were well-intentioned, but they thought that genetics and psychology together was some kind of a fascist mm-hmm. plot. Mm-hmm. And this came about because of the way the Nazis had bastardized human genetics during that period of time from 1933 to 1945. Mm-hmm. And it was very difficult to undo what they had done.
Was it hard for you to sell your dissertation topic to your PhD committee?
The PhD committee was hand-picked by my advisor. My dissertation advisor was Sheldon Reed, whom really? We can talk about a little bit. Mm-hmm. But Sheldon Reed decided that he needed a psychologist who could get interested in genetics. He himself was a fruit fly, Drosophila geneticist, mm-hmm. but he was interested in some of the behavioral aspects of the fly's behavior. Mm-hmm. And he was introduced to me, and vice versa, by D.G. Patterson, who was also a member of the American Civil Liberties Union. You can see that Minnesota ideas about genetics were very liberal mm-hmm. and open-minded. Mm-hmm. And when I got together with Sheldon Reed, he said, we really need a twin study. And because the MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, had been invented here, it would be interesting if somebody could do a twin study of normal twins using a good personality inventory like the MMPI. And that launched me. So in 1957, I started chasing around to the superintendents of schools here in the Twin Cities and learned that there were 31,000 children in grades 9 through 12.
Mm-hmm.
And with the help of the secretaries at the various junior highs and high schools here, I was able to find all those students who had the same last name and the same birth date.
Oh.
That
Well, that's a lot of work for a graduate student.
Oh, you haven't heard the rest of it. I was a one-man show in that time, and I was also married and raising a child. Out of those 31,000 kids, I found 68 pairs of twins, identical and fraternal, same-sex fraternals. And then I began the chore of trying to convince them and their parents to sign off on doing the MMPI and another test by factor analytically derived test as a backup. And we lost some people that way, and 68 pairs survived. And then I started to collect them on Saturdays to come to various churches, YMCAs, what have you, libraries, to sit down and take the test. I also had to convince them that I could get some blood out of them. So I was one of the very first psychologists to try to do zygosity
with blood group markers.
Blood group markers.
Yeah. That would have been very forward-thinking back in 1957. Always.
And I did all this without any external funding, just by my charm and personality. And I convinced the Minneapolis War Memorial Blood Bank that this would be a good opportunity for them to find rare blood types. And they saw the advantage right away. They did all the blood grouping for free.